Tamerra, is it safe to say this was one of your most unique assignments?
100%. I mean, when BayFC approached me last month, inviting me on this road trip with them to Orlando when they faced off against the Pride, joining them on this charter flight, which is made possible now thanks to the new CBA, I don't even think that they finished the full sentence of their question before I was like, yes, where do I need to sign? Like 100%. I've not heard of too many other journalists who've been able to follow along so closely and embed with the team in this kind of way. And for me personally, as someone who is still like relatively early in the women's soccer world as a reporter, despite being a journalist for a decade, I always leap toward the opportunity for these sorts of new experiences. So yes, super unique, especially for me personally, and even more enriching than I anticipated.
So let's start where it all began. You mentioned it was a charter, which in itself is, not every flight is that in the
Right.
NWSL. Take me inside your arrival. Let's start at the beginning.
Yeah. So for people who travel and are familiar with, the typical airport flow, usually, and I know this is sort of like a personality type thing, if your flight's at 9, how early are you arriving at the airport? When you're flying commercial, the first sort of culture shock for me, as someone who like regularly is pushing the envelope when I'm flying commercial in terms of when I arrive at the boarding gate, all that. We left San Jose at 9 a.m. That's when the flight took off. And so typically, if you're flying commercial, you're thinking, okay, domestic flight, boarding's going to be about 8:20, 40 minutes before. Let me make sure that I'm at the airport X, amount of time before that, so I have time to get security, get a snack, stretch my legs, whatever. I was told to report to the airport at 8:15, just 45 minutes before, which in, commercial terms is 5 minutes before boarding. The players did not have to report until 8:30, just 30 minutes before boarding. So already I was like, okay, we are not in Kansas anymore with this trip. And because we flew charter, we didn't have to go through the airport. I didn't have to take off my shoes. There was very light security that took place. And when I tell you, Jill, I pulled up to there's sort of this like holding center where the team sort of set up breakfasts and bagels and stuff for the players to pick up on their way onto the plane. But you didn't even have to stop there. I got out, and probably between where the car was that dropped me off to the steps leading up to the plane was maybe 200 steps. Most of which was outside because you just pass through this building and then you're basically on the airstrip that they share with the greater San Jose airport. So that alone, I was just thinking about how much time this saves, especially considering that it's not just the players that need to be transported from San Jose to Orlando. There were 20 players who traveled and probably an additional 20 staff. And this is operations people from the BayFC data team, the media team, people who get content for the team's social media pages. There was security who traveled with us. There were a couple people from Visa who partner with the club and sort of gave some extra goodies to the players on the flight. This was like a whole operation when it came to getting from point A to B. And again, for me, as someone who typically covers games by just dropping into the stadium a couple hours before kickoff, sitting in the press box, having my little press lunch, watching the game, doing the post-game press conferences, writing the piece. This really extended the roots of what all goes into getting a team, like I said, from point A to B long before they even take the pitch for competition.
Okay, so you're leaving San Jose to fly to Orlando, which is one of the longest road trips in the league at just under 3,000 miles. So you get on the plane. Give us a sense of how embedded you were with this team for what was 38 hours?
Yep. Yeah. And so there's always this kind of like difference when you're going east to west versus west to east. Going from San Jose to Orlando, I think we were in flight for like 4 hours and 53 minutes or something like that, just under 5 hours. On the way back, it was more like 5.5. I think the wind factors into that. But to credit the club, because this was such a unique situation, even I as a journalist had to approach it very carefully, because as someone whose obligation it was to really capture what this team is like when they're traveling, given how little we actually know about the finer details of these sorts of experiences. I needed to be as sort of invisible as possible, as fly on the wall as I could. In the club, when it comes to boarding the plane, they had a sort of like seating assignment where the players sit in the front, the sort of trainers and operations people sit in the middle, and then the like media people sort of sit in the back. So I was
the spies are far removed.
Right, exactly. And, I can completely respect that because
Yes.
at the end of the day, these are professionals. They need to be able to compete. And I could empathize with them not wanting to have to worry about, what a journalist might be jotting down in their notebook if they said something crazy or just themselves. So I was happy to, give them their space as I was throughout the entire trip. And there were a lot of conversations where sometimes I, as a journalist, had to ask, am I able to sit in on this meeting? Am I able to, approach this person? And the club was honest about times where that was okay and maybe times where I needed to sort of take a step back. So I was near the back of the plane, but really it was more like the middle because there were probably 40 something rows on the plane, which was nice because everyone was able to sort of have their own row. Dream scenario when you're flying commercial. That doesn't happen super often. But I'm thinking about the importance of having that space for the players, especially given that we didn't arrive in Orlando until 5 p.m. local time, which gave them basically 24 hours in Florida between when we arrived and when the game took place the following day. But there was a lot of, resting, I would say, for the first couple of hours. It was a fairly early start time. I think the players typically train in the mornings anyway, but when you need to arrive at the airport at 8:30 and you might want to have your coffee, you might need to take care of a pet or something before. There was a lot of like hoodies pulled up, for those first few hours. I got the sense that a lot of them were napping, but maybe 2 or 3 hours into it, that's when you started seeing people stretching their legs a bit, coming to visit, with other sections of the plane or with each other. And honestly, it kind of felt like we blinked and then we were descending. So it was a pretty smooth flight, very chill. It made me just think a lot about how delicate the sort of balance is when it comes to conserving energy on these road trips. And, when you're up at these high altitudes, it's already very demanding on the body. It's dehydrating. The players were given lunch before we got onto the plane since lunch was sort of going to pass while we were in the air. But there were elements of the flight that felt pretty standard. There was still like in-flight service with beverages and snacks in addition to the box lunch that we had. So there were some parts of it that without any sort of context would have felt like a typical flight. But I think for me, the sort of boarding process and the offboarding the process of getting off the plane, disembarking,
there we go.
I know, it's that kind of day, was really where I felt the difference between commercial and charter flights. And again, with such a tight turnaround, that extra hour and a half or 2 hours means so much because we already weren't spending that much time in Orlando as it was.
Sometimes you see pictures on social media or things of teams that do fly charter, like there's no Wi-Fi and they're playing Uno. Was there any kind of cool team moments that you saw?
Not a ton. I mean, true that we did not have Wi-Fi, so I saw some people whipping out the Kindles. Some people, I think, were prepared for that in other ways by downloading things ahead of time. I saw some people
cheaters
who were... Yeah, I know, right? I had no idea, so I brought books. Which I was grateful for, because I assumed that we would have Wi-Fi. I saw some people knitting, which I thought was really interesting.
Who was knitting?
It was someone on the data team. Honestly, I was sitting too far away from
I wanted
the
there to
players.
be a group of knitting, like a player knitting circle so badly.
I'm sure there are. I just wasn't able to see from my vantage point. And like I said, I really had to sort of toe that line between not encroaching on, their boundaries, their space, and letting them just be who they were. Because that's also what enriches the story that I am writing, I don't want to become... Despite my main character tendencies as a Leo rising, I didn't want to be part of that story. I needed to be able to give them the space to be who they were, because that's the enriching information that I think readers have always craved when it comes to knowing more about these players. So, it was actually very chill on the way there. Like I said, there was a lot of napping. There was a little bit of, hopping over to someone else's seat and chatting sometimes between the assistant coach and a player or from player to player. It was a little bit different on the way back, but we'll get to that.
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned the enriching parts that a reader, will just die to get this insight. What were the biggest things that stood out to you on this trip post-flight?
Just how much of an operation it is. Like I said, it's more than just the 20 players who are being transported across the country, on this sort of coast to coast road trip that was very, very tight turnaround. One of the things that struck me actually was the fact that this itinerary came about from player feedback at the end of last season with Bay FC. They really, really value being able to sleep in their own beds, which who could begrudge them for that, because they do spend a lot of time on the road as professional athletes, especially in a league like the NWSL, which requires a lot of travel, more than we see in smaller countries like
So
England.
flying in morning of was an adjustment.
Yes.
Morning of match day -1. Gotcha.
Exactly. So this was actually the player's preference. And there's also some interesting science behind that to sort of back that up that I learned about when I was on this trip, which has to do with like the quality of your sleep and your ability to perform optimally. There's one school of thought that sort of believes that an athlete can have one night of like subpar sleep and still be able to perform at the highest level. But if they have 2 nights of subpar sleep, and if the 2 nights before game day basically is subpar, then they are actually at greater risk of performing below their optimal level. So basically what that means is, from Bay FC's perspective, if the players are able to sleep in their beds on match day -2, so 2 days out from kickoff, even if they have to sleep in a hotel bed, which, a little bit unfamiliar, there's pressure issues, temperature issues with the bed, that whole thing. Even if on match day -1, they get suboptimal sleep quality, the fact that 2 days out from kickoff, their sleep was optimal means that they will actually be able to still perform at the highest level. So from their perspective, by maximizing the amount of time that they can spend in their beds, they are really benefiting the players, ostensibly by the time they get to kickoff. Same goes with time zones, same goes with climate differences, because I will say, for anyone who hasn't been to Florida or anywhere in the Southeast, it is humid. It wasn't hot, but it was definitely humid. It hits you as soon as you step off the plane. But after speaking to players about that, because I was so curious why they preferred this sort of pretty hectic schedule.
Yeah, so they didn't get a training day in market.
Exactly.
Yeah, that is unique and
right.
and new. So then fast forwarding on to game day, how much did things change?
Game day, ironically, felt sort of like the most standard procedure. The difference still, though, for me was actually being with the team so long leading into kickoff. So they are given, schedules. Coach Albertine Montoya said that he, treats this team like the professionals that we have seen long before the NWSL, in that they're not running on sort of a strict, everyone must be down for breakfast by 9:30. He gives them windows. So the players were able to come down for breakfast anywhere between 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. I thought it was kind of funny that probably 98% of the players came between 10:45 and 11, which makes sense.
I tend
considering
to
the difference
go in that
time
direction
zone.
myself. Yes,
Right.
I thoroughly understand that.
I got there at 9:15 being like, okay, it'll be nice to observe everyone as they're, getting their game face on. And I was sitting there just kind of waiting for them for an hour and a half. And then right before 11, there's this huge procession of people coming to eat, which, yes, felt very real. But after that, they had their activations. One thing that I found really fascinating was the fact that Bay FC has a sports psychologist who actually travels with the team. And so after they did sort of their stretching, their morning stretches and activations, she conducted sort of like a mindfulness meditation for players to participate in if they chose, just to get their minds right pregame. I had a really interesting conversation with her. She's actually a former Olympic swimmer. So has a really interesting perspective on all of that and is really passionate about her work. So they do things like that. And I will just as a quick tangent say that while this is happening and we're like 11 a.m. noon, so 5-6 hours before kickoff, some of the operations staff with Bay FC are already at the stadium. They are steaming jerseys, bringing out the players' equipment, cleats, providing them with things like Sour Patch Kids and other like superstitious treats that they need in order to perform their best, because athletes are some of the most superstitious people around. And so I didn't get to the stadium until maybe shortly after 2 p.m., still 3 hours before kickoff, and was able to walk around the stadium, peek inside some of the locker rooms. The players, of course, haven't arrived yet, and just watch this whole other sort of backstage production happening, so that by the time the players arrive, they have everything they need ahead of them, and they have mentally like so much freed up space to just focus on the game. And that was one of the things that I learned BFC as a club really prioritizes. The players honestly just had to show up most of the time. They barely had to lift a finger from when we took off to when we landed.
Anything interesting in anyone's locker, or was that embargoed information?
So I honestly don't know which player this is. Everything was moving so fast, but I do know someone on BFC loves Sour Patch Kids, and I suspect is taking a few of those things down before kickoff, because when I was walking through the locker room, I saw a little bag of them next to their jersey. But I promise, I'm not like trying to be coy. I didn't look at who it was.
Okay, so Bay and Orlando play to a 1-1 draw. Mm-hmm. Do they head right home after that? Is the charter flying overnight?
Basically, I want to say the game ended a few minutes after 7. I don't even think it was fully 10 minutes past 7, with stoppage time, 5 p.m. Eastern kickoff. And I watched the back end of the game from the press box. So as journalists typically do, once the final whistle blows, if not a little bit before, you head down to where the press conferences are going to be. I got there probably about 5:15. And again, there's already production happening. They're wrapping things up. They're packing things in. There is a lot of extra luggage that's involved in these trips, from all of the cameras, the drones that the data team uses for their research, all of the jerseys, all of the players' equipments, everything down to, I'm sure that you've seen in some post-game press conferences, visiting teams will still bring, their club's branding, so that when the players and coach are sitting for the press conferences, that it's Bay FC. Those things need to be packed up, but they can't be packed up before the press conference. So I went back down into the stadium, and it was just like being in the eye of a tornado. Everyone was whirring around, but everyone knew exactly what they needed to do. So it was very controlled chaos. And I just sort of sat there as the players quickly showered. Caprice Didasco and Rachel Kunananji were the two players who sat for the press conference. Albertine Montoya did his part. The players quickly got pizza. It was someone else's responsibility to make sure that the players have a post-game meal. And then they're just whisked onto the bus. And we literally drive from Inter and Co Stadium in Orlando straight to the airport. And again, because it's charter, we just drive straight up to the airplane. Like, they open up a gate for us and we're there. And we don't even have to do security this time, because I guess doing it once was enough. The players were given dinner on their way up the steps onto the plane, and we were taking off at 9 p.m. Mind you, the game ended at like 7:05. And then we landed. So
landing by midnight back on the West Coast? Oh, this is the way to live. Yes. I am so here for this. Now, Tamerra, can you explain to the people how many of these charters that NWSL teams get? Because a lot of Division I collegiate teams always travel charter. In Major League Soccer, since COVID pandemic in 2020, the league has shifted over to all flights are charter. But that is not the case still in the NWSL.
Unfortunately, not the case. Even when we look within women's sports at the the NWSL still has room to grow, we'll say. According to the new CBA, each team is given 6 legs of charter flights, which I say to distinguish it from 3 round trip flights. And I think that that's important because
it's 3 games a year.
3 games a year, and they are able to break it up. So let's just say that Bay FC, when they were looking at this game with Orlando, they found a favorable schedule for a direct flight from San Jose to Orlando going. But let's just say on the return, they weren't able to find anything that would allow the players to sleep in their beds on the night of game day. It would have been possible for them to sort of break up that trip and fly commercial there and charter back. This was not that case. They flew charter both ways. But I do think it's nice that teams are given that much more flexibility, I guess, when it comes to chartering. But yeah, just 3 games, well, 6 legs of a charter flight a year. And there is a mandate that if teams have midweek games, then they must fly charter.
After your nearly 2 days embedded with Bay FC, who did you feel like you're like, oh, that's who I'd sit with, that's who I'd room with?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I think I would go with Rachel Kundananji.
Cool.
And honestly, I probably would have gone with that even before this trip. I thought it was really cool how she was able to make time to visit with her teammates who play for the Pride, but are also from Zambia. So they all share, national team duties together.
Cool.
And I'm always so fascinated when there's
Was that like morning
of
in the lobby? Like when did they link up?
It was after the game. She kind of mentioned right before the press conference started, like, I got to go see my people. Not in a like, let's get the show on the road way, but everyone was rushing. People were just rushing for different reasons. But she just seemed very chill. I thought it was interesting how, because players were given some flexibility in how they spent their days the morning of the match. Like I said, there were a couple of players, for example, who came in at like 9:15 for breakfast, and they were very like AirPods in, head down, getting the game face on. Rachel just sort of seemed to float through the hotel, like with this quiet, confident sense of authority. And I think the fact that she ended up scoring in that Orlando game made me like, okay, she knows what she's doing. She knows what she needs. And that kind of confidence, I think, like meshes well with my personality. So I can see her being a really fun person to room with.
Did anybody like really surprise you?
Honestly, no. I think this is a very young team, and because veterans like Emily Menges and Albie Dahlkemper, who are both center backs and both out on maternity leave right now, did not travel with the team, it did feel like there was a lot of not necessarily cobbling together of relationships, but there were some people who knew that they're morning people, and when they come down for breakfast, they want to chat, they want to watch EPL on the laptop while they eat. There are others who just kind of want to have their music in and keep to themselves. And it was interesting to sort of see how everyone sort of naturally fell into their comfort zone, which is what you want for yourself and your teammate on game day, right? That didn't necessarily surprise me, but like I said, as a journalist who is not often privy to these kinds of moments, there was something really enriching about seeing that. And I think one of my biggest takeaways from the trip, which I'm still processing, is the chasms that can sometimes exist between what we, even as media professionals whose job it is to follow this league as closely as we can think based on what we see from the outside and what's actually happening within the operation of a club. Sometimes those two things can be very, very different. And given, this has been a challenging season for Bay FC. They are still fighting for a playoff spot. Head coach Albertine Montoya is going to be stepping down at the end of the season. There's been a slate of departures of players throughout this season. They are winless since the summer break. There was a sense that like, this might not be the best time to have a journalist, joining us on this trip and nosing around. So I do have to give credit to the club for maintaining this invitation despite, the fairly vulnerable position that they're in. That was something that honestly surprised me because I was prepared for them to be like, now's not the best time. And I would have understood that,
Sure. It's a testament to you, really, Tamerra, to one, get the invite, but two, to just have the trust, and despite things not being super rosy right now, them still saying, hey, like, come be with us for these 2 days. So thank you for sharing this experience with us. And before we say goodbye, if you had to pick one more, your next team to go be an embedded journalist with, which one would it be? Because we're all about putting it out on the ether on this show.
You're right.
Yeah.
From like a sporting side, we all want to know what's going on inside Kansas City's operation. So That would be like if I could have embedded with them actually the same weekend as they're preparing to, well, but they were home against Washington.
Yeah.
But Kansas City, I think for sporting reasons, but for vibes reasons, I almost want to go with Chicago.
Oh, whoa.
My hot take is Chicago is one of the most exciting teams in the NWSL right now, like right now. And they are rabble rousers. They're party crashers. And I expect them to crash some parties between now and the end of the season if they don't make it into the playoffs themselves, because nobody's been eliminated yet. So it would be those two next on the wish list.
Hey, you listening, Chicago? Just saying.
Just saying.
Tamerra, thank you so much.
Thanks, Jill.